Cooking with Struan. Yeah. Welcome to the first YouTube exclusive Cooking with Struan episode. Today we're going to be doing my very own half and half seeded loaf of bread. It's a 1 kilogram loaf, so a decent size too. Here's your ingredients. We'll get started by putting that 2 teaspoons of yeast over the top of a bowl of warm water. Now that's going to allow the oxygen from the air and the warm water to both have contact with the yeast, which will allow it to activate. And then over time, the yeast on the top will settle into the bowl. We are now going to add 500 grams of that plain flour into the mixing bowl. This is the equivalent to just over 4 cups, but 4 cups will do, honestly. So I'm using some scales, but measuring cups are just as easy. And you can see we're also adding that whole meal, same amount, into the same mixing bowl. You want to make sure the 2 flours are well mixed together. The reason we're using both is the white flour tends to be better at rising and a bit lighter, but the whole meal gives a bit more of a oomph taste, I describe it. It's like, I don't know, a bit more satisfying. So now we're putting in the 2 tablespoons of oil, just straight onto that, and mixing it in with our hands. You will find there's clumps of oil throughout, so you'll see that I'm just kind of breaking them up, and then you can shake the entire bowl. And what this does is brings those oil clumps to the top, so you can once again break them up with your fingers. Now we're just adding our 3 teaspoons of table salt to the mixture. And as usual, what that salt does is just bring out the nicer flavors of the bread, just same as whenever else when you're cooking. 10 grams of poppy seeds. 100 to 200 grams of the pumpkin sunflower seed mix. So you can give that mixture a good mix. But now you can see with the bowl of warm water that the top yeast has actually floated down into it. That's allowed all the yeast to get a decent amount of oxygen in it and activate quite quickly. So now just going to mix it up just so when we pour it in, there's no yeast left at the bottom. Now pour it into a divot that you've made in your mixture and give it a good swoosh to get all the yeast off the bottom of that bowl. And we're going to carefully, just from the sides, bring that flour and fold it over top. Be very careful because this can be an easy step to make a mess. So you can see now that it's fairly well combined. It's definitely not a dough yet, but it's not going to leak everywhere all over the table. So you're just going to give your workspace a really healthy dumping of flour and pour your mixture directly onto that. Now you're going to repeatedly fold your dough in on itself until it's a nice dough consistency. If you find it still a bit crumbly, then just add a little bit of water, and vice versa. If it's too wet, add some flour. You will have lots of flour all over your work surface, so make sure you use that and just scrape it in like I'm doing so here. So you can see now it's becoming a lot more of a dough ball, and that's a lot more satisfying. So what you're wanting to do is make it so there's no folds actually on the top. So that's what I'm doing here. So I'm bending it round so that the top is one smooth surface. There is no folds or anything like that, which could expand in the oven. And you'll see here, once I put it flat, it's in a lovely round shape now. So you're going to oil your bowl that you're going to rise it in, put it directly in there, and cover it with some cling film. You don't want the dough to dry out, so make sure it's almost airtight, and then put it into a warm place for about 3 to 4 hours, or even overnight. So you can see here that it has around doubled in size for me. Now you can keep the cling film, so don't throw it away immediately. You can reuse it a bunch of times. And now we're just going to flour down our desk like before. Or if no one else is going to use the desk, just keep it floured. There's no point in cleaning it up and wasting some good flour. The dough will be quite wet when it comes out, so just coat it with flour like I've done there and then gently knead it. You have already kneaded the dough, so make sure you don't overdo it. You don't want an overworked dough. Now with plenty of flour, just coat it again because it will be a bit sticky still, and then we're going to slap it to activate those gluten fibers. Next, we're wanting to roll it into the shape that we're going to prove it in. So I'm going to make a dog bone sort of shape, And the reason I'm doing that is to make it easier to cut. It's not like a sourdough round, it's more like a traditional loaf. So the reason I'm giving it the T-bones up at the top and the bottom, which you'll see in a second, is because the top and bottom need to rise in more directions. So having a bit more mass there gives it a nicer shape at the end. You'll see it in the thumbnail. We are now going to just give another coating of flour and then transfer it onto the baking tray. So we'll let it prove on the baking tray so we don't have to disturb it later. So you can see that I just reshaped it and now I'm just cutting these grooves. So these grooves allow it to expand the areas you want it to expand. If you don't put them in, then it'll tend to just blob out. And then once again, a nice healthy dose of flour and into the oven at 50 degrees or whatever your oven's minimum is for about 45 minutes or for another hour in the warming cupboard you used before. So this is just before proving, you can see it here, and then just after proving, you can see here. Unfortunately, due to the oven being in use, I did prove it for a couple hours too long, but hey, we got a huge loaf out of it, so no complaints there. You're going to want it in the oven at 180 for around 40 minutes, or after proving in the oven, you can just keep it in there and have the oven rise to 180, and that takes around 45 minutes. You know that your loaf's ready both by that nice golden brown colour and by this knocking noise. If it sounds hollow, that means the wet dough in the middle is cooked through and it's ready to be put onto a cooling rack to cool off for the next 10 to 15 minutes. Oh, yum. That cooling time is important because when you cut it, it will just kind of crumble if it's not quite ready. So you can see here, this is just ready about 10 minutes after it came out of the oven. Thank you very much for joining me on this baking adventure today. I hope your bread was just as successful and delicious as mine was. And I trust you'll be joining me every Saturday for my live show, Cooking with Struan, on the Virtual Science Foyer Facebook group.